computer. Yes. Okay, so we are looking at abolitionist actions. And the first abolitionist that we have decided to look at is that of Granville Sharp, who set the tone based on his work with, first of all, Jonathan Strong, and then later on with James Somerset. He brought the case of James Somerset to court, where in June 1772, Lord Mansfield, who was the Lord Chief Justice, made a decision where he basically said that it was impossible for owners to use force against their slaves in England. Somerset was set free, as well as thousands of other slaves in England. Now, this ruling by Lord Mansfield is known as the Mansfield Judgment. The Mansfield Judgment, made in 1772. And it basically marked an official period, or you could say an official start to the abolitionist movement in England, because it was the first time that by rule of law such a decision had been made. So even though we realize that Granville Sharp, through his work, he had gotten Jonathan Strong free previously, but this Mansfield judgment marked the beginning of the end for what we know as the system of slavery which existed in the Caribbean. Why do you think that this decision was so important in laying the foundation for the abolition movement? It's your time to respond. So Ayana, Danielle, Kevina,
Yes, sir.
Serena, it's your time to respond. Why do you think that this set such a precedent for the start of the abolition movement?
Sir, because as we already know, in the British slave laws, slaves were seen as property, not humans. So therefore, we were treated as animals and inhumanely. So when Mansfield decided to rule that slave owners use could not abuse their slaves, it was marking the start of um, England, or people starting to realize that we are people also and we should be treated as such. So basically they were moving from the perspective of looking at us as property and more of as humans, people that need to be respected. That's what I got from it.
Beautiful. Moving along.
Sir,
Yes, you may go ahead.
what I got from it, sir, was that basically slaves are treated like cattle, as Serena said, like they were treated worse than dogs. And the mere fact that a white person who had power chose to stand up for them, showed some of them a change of heart.
All right, thank you. Anyone else want to share? Yes,
I'll go, sir.
Ayana.
So the fact that a white man used his platform to help bring along change because he realized that what's going on isn't okay and it should not exist. I think that was really good, and it helped other people to see that what they're doing isn't right, it shouldn't happen, and that push start the whole getting rid of slavery.
All right, beautiful. All right. Anybody else? All right, beautiful. All right. So if we are going to create a timeline as it relates to moving towards emancipation, as the theme suggests, it's a movement. So the first thing that we would identify as a marker, or the first major event as a marker, would be Lord Mansfield judgment of June 1772. So that's the first thing. All right. So what's the next thing? The next major event on our timeline? Now, Doris Hamilton Willie is going to reveal to us that the Society for the Effective Abolition of the Slave Trade was what came next. So the victory by the abolitionists marked a critical turning point in the history, and it led them to, in 1787, start what is described as an anti-slavery society, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. So in 1787, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was formed. And we will realize that among important individuals who were a part of the movement outside of Granville Sharp were William Wilberforce. And Wilberforce was, you could say, the most critical individual in getting the slave trade abolished, right? So he was fundamental in ensuring that this atrocity did not continue. So we have William Wilberforce, Granville Sharp, Thomas Clarkson. These individuals were critical. The society was determined to have a law passed in Parliament to abolish the slave trade, following which it was felt that slavery would be forced to collapse once the supply of slaves had dried up. This is according to Doris Hamilton Willie. Now, we realize that the slave trade and the slavery worked hand in hand because, one, if there were no slaves brought to the Caribbean, essentially, based on the treatment that we saw in theme 2 and also in a part of theme 1, that no slaves would be left because the planters, they were not treating the slaves in a good way at all. They were inhumanely treated. So as a result, essentially and eventually, they felt that, hey, if we are able to get rid of the slave trade, then eventually slavery would collapse. Good reasoning? Do you think that that would be the case?
Yes, sir. In a sense, I think that it was a smart decision. But then again, they failed to realize that planters could adapt and start changing their tactics as that actually happened. They started allowing slave women to bring forth children, and I think there were rewards given to women for that. So they shifted their tactics in order to keep slavery going. But based on what you're saying, I think it was a good tactic to end the slave trade, and I believe that it actually put a great deal of or I think that it played an integral part in causing the collapse of slavery, basically.
Very good. So we realized that the planters, they were smart, because we realized that after 1808, a lot of plantations, areas, especially like in Jamaica, many of the areas were used as breeding plantations for making new slaves to add to the plantation areas. But aside from that, we recognize that this move towards the abolition of the slave trade was critical, because they recognized that they could not simply just get rid of slavery. However, they realized that it would take time for slavery to be abolished in totality, right? So in 1807, after years and years of trying, the House passed an act which would bring about the end of the slave trade as of January 1, 1808. So the act was passed in 1807, and the act would become law in 1808, January 1. So we realize that the next big date as it relates to emancipation, the movement towards the end of slavery, end of all this turmoil. So the next big date is 1807 and 1808. So in 1808, it became illegal for British, note, for British vessels to take slaves from the West African coast or anywhere else in Africa and bring them to the New World to distribute to British colonies, right? So that was a critical phase. Now, let us see what the British government said. So in 1807, the British government was finally persuaded to pass the act to abolish the slave trade for the following reasons. What were the reasons? So of course, the hard and the relentless work that was done by the abolitionists. So the work of all the abolitionists. So the work of William Wilberforce, the work of Thomas Clarkson, the work of Granville Sharp. All of these individuals, they continued to press home the issue that slavery should not continue and that the slave trade should be abolished as a sign from England that they recognize the illegitimacy of this trade in Africans. All right. Also, the planters in the older British colonies like Jamaica and Barbados were supportive of abolition. They believed that if the slave trade was extended to the colonies, which were acquired during the Revolutionary and the Napoleonic Wars, for example, Trinidad, St. Lucia, and Tobago, these colonies would begin to produce sugar, and market conditions would deteriorate further with the introduction of sugar from these territories. Doris Hamilton Willie here telling us once again that, hey, so we had Jamaica, and Barbados as British territories prior to the Napoleonic Wars, right? And we speak of the Napoleonic Wars during that period when the Haitian Revolution was taking place, right? So these new territories were added during that period. So St. Lucia and Trinidad and Tobago. So the other planters in the Caribbean, they said that, hey, then wait, if these new territories that are coming on stream now for Britain, if they start producing sugar, it is going to lead to the deterioration of the quality and also the performance, the amount of money that can be gotten from the sale of sugar. So instead of allowing that to happen, they say it's best that we also join with the British government to say that this thing called slavery needs to be ended, because once it ends, then we will be able to maintain, because we already have slaves, maintain the slaves that we have, and also now we will be able to have less competition because no more competitors will be present. Okay, got it?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
All right, beautiful. So let us skip now and go into what comes next. So we realize that we have that date of 1808 when slavery was abolished, January 1. The next important date that we will come to now is 1816. Can you tell me what happened in 1816? What
I
happened?
believe that there was a rebellion. I'm not sure if that's what you're looking for, but I believe there was a rebellion in 1816.
All right, so there was a rebellion in 1816, yes. So there was a rebellion in 1816. Where did this rebellion take place?
Sir, was it Barbados?
Yes, in Barbados. So it did take place in Barbados. Why did it take place?
Sir, I believe that you said that it took place because the slaves believed that the planters were withholding their freedom because they thought that the act of ending the slave trade was a sign that they were free, and they thought that their masters were keeping them against law, so they decided to fight for their freedom.
Okay. All right. Beautiful. However, it wasn't because the slave trade had ended. Something important happened in 1816. The registration bill. So Parliament passed now what is described as the registration bill. All right. What was the registration bill? So now that abolition had gone forth, abolition of the slave trade, the government in England sought to allow the planters now to register their slaves to see how many slaves was on a particular plantation. And of course, by registration, then they would be able to say, all right, so 500 slaves, that's what you, 500 slaves, that's what you have. So if you start the year with 500 slaves, we expect that you will end the year with 500 slaves. However, if slaves are born, then of course We'll add that to the total. If slaves are dead, then we will subtract that from the total, right? So the whole idea now of issuing death certificate and birth certificate for slaves, registration, right? So each slave that was born had to be registered. Each slave that died had to be registered. Good? So that was the idea of the registration bill. Now, let us factor now what took place in Barbados with what was coming from England. So the message was sent, register all the slaves, right? How could that have been misinterpreted as abolition? Have you ever played Chinese telephone?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes. So, and remember we had said that in 1772, Lord Mansfield made that declaration that all slaves in England, all blacks in England should now be free. Do you think that many blacks remained in England? Do you believe that after that declaration, many blacks remained in England?
Not necessarily, sir. They probably would want to move as far away from their farmer masses as possible.
Okay. All right. So many stayed. And guess what? They continued in the different occupations that were made available for them. Because as you know, the whites were not willing always to do every kind of occupation, right? So where they were able to, they stayed in and around the docks, in and around the town centers and wherever. Now, they were also working on ships, yes? And we can imagine that when this information was passed that slaves should be registered, many of the whites and also the blacks, they passed on the information that they heard, that they overheard, that some of them read and passed it on Chinese telephone style. When it got to the plantations, many of the slaves hearing this information, misinterpreting the information, figured that the whites were withholding their liberation. As a result, the Barbados Rebellion of 1816, because they heard abolition when it was actually registration which was supposed to take place. So that is one of the key things that started the Barbados Rebellion, because the slaves felt that the masters were denying them or restricting them from becoming freed. Right? So that was 1816. Fast forward now into the 20s, into the 1820s. We have 1823, another critical area in the abolition movement. Can you tell me what important occurrence took place in 1823? What happened in 1823? Nobody? In the Caribbean, anything happened in 1823?
Sir, did that have to do with have anything to do with Guyana?
Definitely. What happened in a little area in Guyana?
I'm not exactly sure, sir, but I believe they stopped working, basically went on strike and demanded their freedom.
All right, beautiful. So what we had now in 1823 was the Demerara Revolt or the Demerara Rebellion. Now, sparked by something that actually took place in England again. Now, we realize that the abolitionists, they were pushing for an end to slavery. And in 1823, the battle began to wage on even further. And a new abolition society, the London Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery, was formed in 1823. So now that they had become successful with getting rid of the slave trade, they formed another society, the London Society for the Mitigation and the Gradual Abolition of Slavery, with the spokesman as Thomas Fowley Buxton, and he was also a chief parliamentary spokesman on slavery. Right? So they had 220 branches opened in cities and towns right throughout Britain. They sent 750 petitions to Parliament and a newspaper, the Anti-Slavery Monthly Reporter. So they were pushing, they were knocking on the door, they were being very bothersome. Now, what happened was this. The society wanted amelioration to be made part of the government's policy to be introduced by law and to be followed by abolition at an early date. Buxton in 1823 introduced his famous resolution in the House of Commons that slavery ought to be gradually abolished throughout the British colonies. And of course, the planters didn't want slavery to end. So what they did, they hugged up amelioration. They agreed on amelioration. They agreed to amelioration. Now, what is amelioration? That is the question. Let me hear your thoughts. What is amelioration?
Sir, hearing the word straight up and doing French, I know that amelioration would be improvement in French. So I guess amelioration would be like improvement in how slaves are treated or the conditions.
Excellent. So amelioration was a policy put in place by the British government as a means of improving the conditions of the slaves in the British Caribbean territories, right? So that's what amelioration was. So it was a bunch of proposals, right? So what did the proposals have? One, female slaves should not be flogged. So female slaves should not get a beaten. They should not be whipped, right? Do you agree?
Yes, sir. But no one should
But
be
yeah, wouldn't want them to beat the males either, but I guess it's an improvement.
All right, good. a day should elapse between the time a male slave committed an offense and the time he was flogged. So 1 day should subside between crime and punishment. Make sense? Why?
Sir, I don't really see the sense in it though.
In the delay?
Mm. I'm trying to look for it, but I don't see it. If it was that he was getting multiple beatings, if that was the case, and they spread out the beatings, then I would understand that. But then having a day in between the crime and the, I guess it could serve as a time period for them to decide on a fair punishment and not do it out of anger, I guess, if they were using it for that purpose.
Ah, beautiful. Now you come to it. That is the reason. So the thinking was that you should not punish the slave when you are angry or hot-blooded. But of course, after 24 hours, you should calm down, don't? Yeah? Have you ever been upset and then a good night's sleep and in the morning you're not so upset? Has that
Yes,
ever happened?
yes, sir.
All
Yes,
right.
sir.
So that was the thinking. That was indeed the thinking. All right, let's go to another one of the proposals. A record should be kept of floggings. So once you have received 3 lashes or more, then records should be kept. And these records should be submitted to the magistrate at every quarter. Make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
All right. And of course, there are a lot more examples of what was in the proposals. For example, slave marriages should be encouraged. All children born after 1823 should be emancipated, and those who remained in bondage should be protected from flagrant abuses. So we realize that from the perspective of both planters and slaves, there were a lot of so-called improvements. However, what is on paper versus what happened in practice was completely different. We realize that, hey, they did not live up to what was on the paper at all. So instead of treating the slaves fairly, instead of carrying out the proposals as introduced, the planters failed miserably to carry them out. Failed miserably to carry them out. Even though many of the proposals, we will realize, was actually introduced and suggested by these said planters. They were the ones who said, all right, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll do that. Right? But of course, no such thing was done. Now, let's hear this reading from Doris Hamilton. If the planters were willing to adopt the proposals, the pro-slavery felt that they would be able to appease the humanitarians, thus undermine the efforts of the abolitionists, and by and large, forestalling the movement and prolonging slavery. So in their thinking, them say, okay, if we adopt these proposals, then we are going to delay the inevitable. We are going to delay slavery. The West India interests. Who were the West India interests? Come on, talk to me. Who were the West India interests? Hello? Who were the West India interests? All right, so the West India interests would have been all those individuals that stood to benefit from the continuation of plantation slavery, right? Primarily, of course, the planters. So they were the West India interests, and they were also the West India lobby. So they were the ones who were lobbying and also fighting for, say, let us continue with this slavery as it exists. All right?
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, what was the response of? What was the response of the planters to amelioration? Now, the self-governing islands were encouraged to have their assemblies adopt the amelioration proposals, right? And I'm reading from your movements towards emancipation by Doris Hamilton Willie once again. In the crown colonies of Trinidad, Demerara, and St. Lucia, where the crown had greater powers, the governments were ordered to carry them out. However, they were fiercely resisted in all the colonies. In Dominica, the planters talked about independence, as in getting their independence from Great Britain and continuing with slavery. In Barbados, the assembly argued that their slave laws were already a long list of favors granted to the slaves. So they are saying that, hey, laws that we have implemented, these laws are benefiting the slaves already. Why would we want to go and create a new set of proposals, a new set of laws for them? They're lucky they have any laws, any rights. In Trinidad, the planters asked for them to be withdrawn, while the governor of Demerara refused to publish them right away because he was fearful that they might lead to a slave revolt. And we saw that this is exactly what happened. The 1826 revised slave code in Jamaica violated the amelioration proposals, because remember that for the British slave laws, each colony basically drew up its own set of laws, right? Because British slave laws were not made in the mother country like that of Spain and France, but rather the planters drew up their laws based on what was happening in their territories. So in 1826, we see Jamaica revising their slave laws. Let's see what happened. It forbade slaves to receive religious instructions. It forbade church services between sunrise and sunset. And it opposed the slaves preaching without their owners' consent. In the end, most of the assemblies consented to enact only a few of the less important measures, which made a little difference to the practice of slavery. The officials who were to carry out the proposals were either slave owners themselves or were sympathetic to the slave owners. So we see that the amelioration proposals were pretty much only on paper. And in terms of actually coming to fruition, they were definitely not. When we come back, we will look at the next phase of the movement, which will take us into Jamaica in 1831, looking at the Christmas Rebellion and the Christmas Rebellion or the Sam Sharp Rebellion, and then we will move into the Abolition Act and apprenticeship, and finally we'll see where slavery now was abolished. So we have been looking today at what was taking place in the British Caribbean territories as it relates to a movement towards emancipation. Once we are finished looking at the movements towards emancipation in the British territories, we will need to establish what took place in the other significant European territories. We will look at the Spanish emancipation movement, and we will also look at the French emancipation movement. And then we will see what really happened as it relates to the end of slavery.